All right, hello everybody. Here we are, almost at the midpoint of the course, and we're finally to the psychology is born. Okay, now we're in this chapter. I want you to notice. I mean, it's called early approaches to psychology. I want you to notice that we're going to focus incredibly much focus on that direction that American psychology went. But that's not to say that there weren't other approaches to psychology that didn't did not influence later as much as these others. So we're going to talk about volunteerism and structuralism as our two main early approaches to psychology. But at the very end, we're going to shove on act psychology. But there was quite a few other approaches to psychology as well. It's just our history of psychology goes through the volunteerism leads to structuralism. Structuralism pisses off everybody and leads to functionalism and behaviorism and all the other isms like Gestalt. I mean, it leads to all of them. Okay? So, before I go anywhere, I want to talk about a school of psychology. Now, we don't exactly have schools of psychology anymore, but putting it briefly, back in about at this time, if you were to find a textbook in psychology, there would be a book. It would just be psychology, and it would incorporate the entire discipline. Okay? Now, clearly, nowadays, the field of psychology has expanded so greatly that there are books, journals, millions of pages about psychology. Okay? At this point, there was 500. And so what could happen is any one person could be just a psychologist. And that psychologist would then have a angle, a way of viewing psychology called a school. So a school is sort of like a group of scientists who share common assumptions, goals, problems, and methods. But within that school, I mean, all branches, they would view psychology as just one thing, right? Because there's only 500 pages, and come on, if there's one book, 500 pages, you can be a psychologist. Okay, we're going to talk about that later when we get to the divisions of psychology. But for now, it was a small discipline, and at the beginning, the first school of psychology was volunteerism, and we're going to talk about it, and it's based on the voluntary nature. That is to say, the early psychologists were impressed by the voluntary nature of consciousness. Followed by the structuralist behaviors, Gestalt, etc. Okay, kind of similar to Kuhn's notion of a paradigm, sort of, a little bit different. The two big ones we're going to talk about, as I've said, is voluntarism and structuralism. I want a very interesting little tidbit. When I was in college taking this exact course myself, there was no voluntarism in our textbook. It didn't exist in our textbook. Instead, it was just structuralism. And in fact, what we found was that Wilhelm Wundt was going to be the original founder of psychology, and he's German, and he had many students. Okay, William James and Tichenor were two of the big ones. Okay, and here's Tichenor. And Tichenor came to America. He was actually British, but anyway, he comes to America, and he brings Wundt's ideas with him, and he translates them into English. And everybody assumed for 100 years that Tichenor's translation of Wundt was an accurate translation of Wundt. But later on, when somebody went back to Wundt's original work and retranslated it, they found that what Tichenor said was radically different than what Wundt had said. And so at this point, we consider the work of Wilhelm Wundt and the work of Tichenor to be different from each other, though leading into each other. Voluntarism leads to structuralism, but they are considered to be separate fields now. Wilhelm Wundt was most influenced by the rationalists and the psychophysicists. That is to say, the methodology from the psychophysics and the rationalistic thinking. We're going to talk about it because remember, the rationalists proposed an active mind, and voluntarism is going to be all about the voluntary nature of consciousness, the active. Okay? The structuralists, on the other hand, are going to be much more proposing much more of a passive mind that shit just happens, things just go together, just like the empiricists had done, but they also were influenced much by the psychophysical methods. Okay. And so the zeitgeist at this point is the scientific psychology is struggling. It's not well accepted. We're going to get into some of this. We already saw that people such as Galileo had said, you know what, psychology can't be a science. Okay? Even Herbart had said psychology can't, it can be an experimental discipline, but it can't be a science because it requires you to chop it up and etc. and etc. And so there's a lot of people saying psychology can't be science. And you psychologists got a chip on their shoulder, okay? Even we're going to come up to Pavlov later on, and I mean, Pavlov, who started out as a physiologist, really had a low respect for psychology. And we're going to find later on that when he discovered that he was going to have to enter the realm of psychology, he was pissed. He was not happy to move into psychology. So I'm going to start a little bit here with Wilhelm Wundt's this device. This is an early device. He did a lot of interesting stuff, but this is an early device that he used. What he would do is he would have people when the bell would ding, we want you to shift your attention from the bell to the metronome or something. It doesn't matter. The idea is ding, shift. And he found that it took 1/10 of a second to shift your attention. And he was impressed by a lot of things. Number one, he was able to quantitatively measure an internal mental process, attention. And he was most impressed, though, was that this shifting of attention was a voluntary process. Okay, we're going to get to a few more reasons why Wilhelm Wundt's school of psychology is going to be called volunteerism. But right up front, he was impressed that the ability to shift your attention is a voluntary process. Okay? Hey, buddy. I didn't do that. All right. And so the will, according to Wilhelm Wundt, that aspect of humans that allow us to direct our attention. Okay? The will is the thing that makes for voluntary. Volunteerism is a name given to Wilhelm Wundt's school of psychology because his belief that through the process of apperception, we're going to come to that in the next slide, individuals could voluntarily direct their attention wherever they want. All right. Happy birthday to psychology. Happy birthday to psychology. Alright, when I get to the how old are you? It's a tough question. So, 1879, Wilhelm Wundt's research laboratory is functioning. See, some people argue that 1875 should be the birth of psychology because the very first laboratory was created, the psychology laboratory by William James at Harvard. But William James's laboratory at Harvard was for teaching demonstrations only, had no research function, whereas Wilhelm Wundt's was a research laboratory. Okay, so Wilhelm Wundt gets himself this laboratory, but his laboratory was really just a janitor's closet, essentially. Okay, but they didn't even list it in. It was called the Institute for Experimental Psychology. It wasn't even enlisted in the catalog for the university until. By the way, this is at Leipzig, University of Leipzig. Did I say that? Yeah, whatever. Leipzig. It wasn't even listed in the university catalog until 1883, but eventually he had classes of 250. He got a 9-room space later on. He was given his own building that he was allowed to. He supervised 186 doctoral theses. This guy was crazy, okay? I don't remember the number. They work it out. He was such a writer. He wrote so much stuff that in his lifetime, he had one word published every 2 minutes of his life. Once, for 68 years. And I don't know if you've ever done publishing. You know that for every word you write, there's going to be 10 words that don't get published because you edited them out. So he had one published word for every 2 minutes of his life. I mean, that is just nuts. 30 words an hour. Published words. I mean, that's just crazy. So even in his autobiography, he was such a worker. Even in his autobiography, he writes this just massive autobiography, and his wife and his children get one paragraph in his autobiography. All right, so coming back to Wilhelm Wundt. He believed that psychology had become an experimental science. Okay, you can use experimentation to reveal the basic processes of the mind, and he felt, though, that higher processes couldn't be divvied up in the same way. Okay, and this is, again, sort of like Herbart had said, it can be experimental, but I'm not sure if it can be a science in a science sense. But anyway, So he was focused on, like I said, these simple things. Let us remember the rule, valid for psychology as well as other science. We cannot understand the complex phenomenon before we have become familiar with the simple ones which predate the former. Okay? In other words, keep it simple. And this is an interesting rule because we're going to talk about it. I mean, if you want to understand how gravity works, should you look at the universe or should you look at, keys falling? Keys falling, right? Keep it simple first. And so he really kept it simple first. Hey, you. Okay. There. There. Whatever. I'm out of order. Here I go. Introspection. We have seen introspection before. I mean, it originated with Plato. Hence, the whole Wilhelm Wundt was influenced by the rationalists. Introspection is this reflection on your internal experiences. Now, we're going to find that Tichenor is going to Tichenor, who's going to follow, Tichenor is going to use much of the same approach that the early Christian philosophers. If you want to know God, turn inside yourself and find Him. Wilhelm Wundt is going to use introspection that's much, much, much more in line with what the psychophysicists had done. That is to say, I'm going to add, and you tell me, do you feel 1 point or 2 points? 1 point or 2 points? 1 point or 2 points? And so it's very, very what they would call experimental introspection instead of pure. And so moving on to what we have now is that what are thoughts? According to Wundt, we have sensations. Sensation is a basic mental experience that is triggered by an environmental stimulus. Again, this ought to be sounding familiar because this is essentially what John Locke had been saying. Okay? When a sense organ is stimulated and resulting impulse reaches the brain, and remember he had talked about an idea is a sensation or the lingering of a sensation or some shit like that. So it's okay. It's okay. He also, however, had the other elements of thought are feelings. Feelings are the basic elements of emotion that accompany. Okay? And so he says sensations and feelings are the elements of thought. All right? So these two things, there's four things. These two things create all thoughts. Okay? So he says, though these sensations and feelings are the elements of consciousness, you can't really experience them in isolation because they're always connected together. They occur in a big complex thing, okay? So perception is a mental experience that occurs when all of these sensations are given meaning by memory of past experiences, okay? He says perception is passive and involuntary. However, apperception is that part of a perceptual field that a person chooses voluntarily to direct their attention to is that part that is apperceived. Apperception is active and voluntary. Okay, he makes a distinction between these two. He also makes reference to creative synthesis, the voluntary arrangement and rearrangement of mental events that can result from apperception. Okay, the voluntary nature with which attended sensations can be combined separates psychology from the physical sciences, because in the physical sciences, and in fact we already had this with mental chemistry with John Stuart Mill, where he said, look, if you take hydrogen and oxygen and put them next to each other, they can't choose not to become water. They just do. It just happens. He said, no, says Wilhelm Wundt. Look, we have the same elements in the same kind of way that chemistry does, but unlike something like chemistry, these the combination of these sensations and feelings is something that is voluntary. Keeps coming up to that voluntary thing, doesn't it? Now, Tichenor, as I said, was an interesting character. He was very British. This guy is so British. He is so stuffy. The absolute, every stereotype you've got about the old British gentleman, here he is. He rules. He very interesting. When he graduated with his PhD from Wilhelm Wundt, and Wundt, by the way, gave out the very first psychology PhD. Wundt himself was actually had a philosophy PhD. And so Tichenor was among the very fierce. He didn't get the first doctorate in psychology, but it was pretty early. Wundt was definitely the first character to get him out. First character. First person. So what Tichenor, when he graduated, he gets himself two offers. He gets an offer at like Oxford, I think it is, and he gets an offer at Syracuse. Damn, it's upstate New York. One of the upstate New York schools. I can't remember which one it is, but I guess it was Syracuse. Now he wants to go to Oxford so bad. It's like, dude, if you're British, Oxford, Syracuse, that's just a joke, man. So he's like, damn, I want Oxford. But they didn't offer him any research facility. And he's like, I can't do this. I mean, I have to have this research facility. So he went to Rochester. Damn, I don't remember. It's either Syracuse or Rochester. It's the upstate New York once. But anyway, he goes there and he rules his lab. I mean, the old phrase, he ruled his lab with an iron fist. You know, it really works well for this guy because I mean, he was in charge. He kept things on the straight and narrow. If you had an idea that was different from his, you better keep that shit to yourself because you are fired if you even express slight disinterest. Apparently, he had just this really firm control over his brand of psychology. And as I said, when he came to America, he translated Wundt into English, and everybody assumed that what he translated equaled Wundt, but it didn't. Okay? So here's psychology's goals according to Tichenor. The study of consciousness, or the sum total of mental experience. According to him, the mind is the accumulation of experiences across a lifetime, and the psychology's goals are to determine the what, how, and why of mental experiences. And again, he brought this same as Wundt had said, the sensations and the feelings were the elements of thought. And so he had the same kind of a thing. He wanted to break down, and see, here's the thing. Tichenor was very elementistic. He wanted to break down thought, break down consciousness into its elementary components, into its smallest pieces, to find out what the pieces are. Okay? What they are, how they combine, and why they combine. Okay? No. The what was a catalog. So he wanted to, just like in chemistry, you've got your periodic table of the elements and they all break down. He wanted to break down mental experiences and find every different piece of consciousness that he could find. Okay? He ended up with a catalog almost that was the catalog. I can't remember the numbers, but there was somewhere around 30,000 sensations that were related to vision, and like 10,000 that were related to hearing, and like 200 that were related to smell, and each sense organ had its own. It was quite a interesting breakdown. The how is how they come together, and the answer is voluntarily, according to Wundt, right? But he wanted to find out how they went and combined, and he, in particular, wanted to find out why they go together, okay? And so structuralism is this notion. See, Tichenor's brand of psychology, what he was looking for was to take consciousness and break it down and find the component structure of consciousness, and hence structuralism as the name of his school. For Wundt, introspection was different. Well, no, for Wundt, introspection was used to report the presence or absence and the presence or absence of a physical event. Like the Fechner's method of limits. Remember that Fechner's method of limits? At the audiologist, they start playing a sound. Raise your hand when you hear it. It's just report whether or not you hear the event. That's it. Okay. Tichenor, on the other hand, was much more of pure introspection. Look inside yourself and find the basic raw components. And so here's introspection according to Tichenor. So you look at an apple, and your job is to find the elements of consciousness, elements of this experience, okay? So you go, shiny. Shiny. That's one of the elements of sensation through vision. Smooth. Oh, that's an element of the sense. Okay, whatever, okay? Break it all down. But if you look at it and you go, apple, you get a structure smacked down, because I tell you, you committed the stimulus error. You've let past experience, in this case past experience with language, interfere with your introspective report. You're supposed to, remember now, this is sort of like, this introspection originated way back with Plato, when the job was your soul knows the answer. Look inside your soul. Remember that? And then your soul was born onto this planet and put into a body which saw each and every individual dog. If you want to know a true dog, look inside yourself. Your soul knows the answer. Remember that? That truth can never be found here on this earth. So what he's saying is if you rely on your previous experiences, you're not reporting the consciousness itself. You're reporting prior experiences. Okay, you need to let that all go and report the experiences. Rumor has it, it's probably true too, that he was such a hard ass on this stuff. He when his doctoral student went out to get married, he told the student, look, okay, you can take 3 days off for your honeymoon, but while you're on your honeymoon, you damn well better introspect on your wedding bed, okay? Because we don't have any access to that first night on the wedding bed, and here's an opportunity. So he gave him 3 days off, but said, while you're out there, you still have to introspect on sex. So Wundt was an interesting thing, okay? The elemental processes of consciousness consist of sensations, images, and affections. Okay? The sensations were the elements of perceptions, the images are the elements of an idea, etc. And so it doesn't really matter. And so, briefly before I leave him, Tichenor's structuralism was so influential. I mean, you want to talk about the history of psychology, all American psychology after this point is going to come from Tichenor. And it's not because Tichenor is so good, it's because he was so shit. This is such bad psychology, so terrible stuff that everybody said structuralism and the introspection that it uses sucks so bad. I can do better. You're going to find, say, for example, let's say the functionalists. The functionalists say, who gives a shit what the elements are? Let's talk about what we use it for. The behaviorists are going to say, are you kidding me? This is supposed to be science, and you're having people turn in and look inside their mind. In science, you have to have publicly observable data. You can't publicly observe that crap. The Gestalt psychologists are going to come out and say, you can't, the whole is more than the sum of its parts. By breaking down the conscious experience of apple into shiny, red, and smooth, you missed something. You lost some part of the experience. So basically, all psychology's history after this point is going to be structuralism sucks. Let's do better than this, okay? So we need to know what it is because it sucks so bad. Well, here's a little side note. This isn't completely, it's not like, trust me, our history of psychology went voluntarism, structuralism, and then functionalism, behaviorism, Gestalt, etc. But there was some others, and here's one: ACT psychology. It's Franz Brentano's brand of psychology. ACT psychology dealt with the interaction between mental processes and physical events, right? It's called ACT psychology because of intentionality. Mental acts always intend something. So to study a mental act all by itself doesn't make sense. You need to find out what the mental acts embrace. Okay? And so he had a slightly different form of introspection, not really necessarily worth talking about. But this ACT psychology, again, it was influential because the functionalists, which I believe may well be in the next chapter, I'm not positive, I don't remember which chapter's which. Functional psychology, the functionalist school of psychology, is going to embrace this concept from ACT psychology that who cares what the elements are? You need to know the purpose. What's the function? What's the point? Okay? And so if you take a look in your textbook, you're going to find towards the end of this chapter on the early approaches to psychology, you're going to find there's a variety of other early approaches, but clearly, our history comes through voluntarism, Wilhelm Wundt, and structuralism, Edward Tichenor. All right, so I'll see you next time, and I don't know what we're going to talk about. All right, we'll find out when we get there.